as Director of Public Works for the town of Falmouth, I also teach water resources at Cape Cod Community College. So I take a much broader, holistic approach with regard to just about everything that's been discussed here and then some, from the regulators all the way down on water and wastewater. I think what is really important here is to keep a total focus, because when we're dealing with wastewater, the wastewater had to come somewhere. So we are depleting water resources, and this is not just something that we are facing here, but it's a global issue. So when we're talking about climate change and any of these issues, think about this. The world's population currently is about 7 billion people. It's going to be 9 billion people over the next 30 to 40 years. So if you can imagine whatever problems we have here now, magnify by about a third to see where we're going to be in the future. And there are no solutions for any of that. Over half of the world's population lacks basic sanitation. Fully 1.5 million people are dying annually as a result of waterborne disease. And here in this country, we've become very, very spoiled. So even when we talk about climate change, being on the panel for climate change as well as being on the first international symposium that they had in DC about 3 years ago, it was a 3-day event. ORD, or the Office of Research and Development for EPA, was there, and I was glad to hear him speak this morning because he said one thing that was absolutely correct. Wastewater is a derogatory term, if you think about it. Wastewater is going to be the resource of the future, and that's absolutely necessary. When you call it wastewater, you are demeaning the value of it. It connotes no value or valueless. If it's valueless, why are you even sitting here today? Because we are talking about spending over $300 million on something that's totally valueless. So it's not. It's a mechanism for the future. When we were talking about climate change, both at the state level and nationally, as soon as you mention those words climate change, you polarize the audience. And I'm sure it even did here today. And many of you probably believe in climate change. Even those who believe in climate change, it's further polarized in that you have those who believe it's man-made and those who believe it's a natural event. So to have an intelligent discussion about climate change and its impacts is almost impossible to do when you're trying to deal with an audience like that. But Mr. Patrick correctly identified what the real issue is. It doesn't matter if it's man-made. It doesn't matter if it's a natural event. What matters is being prepared for it. Being prepared for it is common sense. So when we talk about flooding, does it mean Falmouth's going underwater? No. Are we going to have a sea level rise that's going to have a measurable impact on our coast? Yes, that's true. Is it going to be as bad as what the Gulf Coast is going to experience? Absolutely not. They're probably going to have 3 times the sea level rise effect that we're going to have here. But think about this. What about population shifts? As a result of global warming, you are going to see fairly large shifts in the populations and the demographics throughout this country, throughout the world for that matter. So people who live in those areas are going to relocate, and other areas have to be prepared for what that's going to be. For us here in Falmouth, or for any place on Cape Cod or along the shoreline in Massachusetts, it makes absolute sense to be thinking about the impacts of climate change, because they're the same impacts that a hurricane has. So if you are properly preparing for storm events, then you are properly preparing for climate change. So that's my professional belief, and that's why it's in Falmouth's best interest that we do that. But we don't do it by having a discussion entirely on climate change. Climate change impacts everything that we've been talking about here this morning. It does impact the wastewater infrastructure. It does impact the embayment systems we're trying to protect. It does impact human health. So across the board, we haven't even gotten into water resources, and that's certainly not the purpose of anyone here today. But I think where the failings are is rigidity. And I kind of use a command and control structure at the federal level to identify that. That you have community policing and conventional policing. Conventional policing is almost always after the fact. Lock them up after the event has already happened. The concept behind community policing is to try to prevent it from happening in the first place. So you kind of have to ask yourself, which one's really more effective in the long run? It's the community policing concept. But when you look at a regulatory model, it's command and control. It's hard and fast. This is what you're going to do. This is how you're going to do it. This is when you're going to do it. And I know that you heard from EPA this morning, and I thought that they were very articulate, very eloquent in how they expressed EPA as an agency. But when you deal with EPA on the ground, it's a different animal. When you're into that implementation, permit, and enforcement, it becomes a much different animal. The example for you here locally is the facilities plan that was recently completed 2 years ago and was getting ready to go to the state. There were no options for that plan. The regulations did not provide for adaptive management strategies. They did not provide for alternatives. It was extremely rigid. Here's a TNDL, it's a number, and you will have to meet the number, and you're going to produce a document that meets that number 100%. It wasn't geared over time. It didn't say you had 30 years to do it. It says you must show us now that you are going to do it now. So it was very, very rigid. Fortunately, that actually took place because that's what brought the regulators, in a sense, back to reality. To start understanding that the magnitude of the cost that we are going to incur on these types of issues, society could no longer afford it. We have to be doing things better, and we have to be able to look at these alternative strategies. To understand the regulators' models, however, please try to understand this, however. When you think about pharmaceuticals, and I'm giving a presentation on pharmaceuticals and drinking water tomorrow, but when you think about pharmaceuticals, as an example, it costs a lot more money to produce any pharmaceutical in this country than it generally does anywhere else on earth. And that's because the standards for performance are all the way up here. From a regulatory perspective, that's generally where the regulatory standards are for clean air and clean water. So they're trying to meet their goals, but they're doing it in much too rigid of a format. And that's what really needs to change. To give you a little bit of an example along those lines, when you're talking about EPA, you had EPA as an agency, didn't come into play until 1970. Its precursor, the act that gave authorization to create EPA, was also in 1970, and that was NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. The Clean Water Act was 1972, Safe Drinking Water Act was 74, and on and on. And then they had those unfunded mandates, which meant that you're going to have to comply with these acts. The biggest contributors to the pollution in this country wasn't necessarily industry, it was municipalities, the big cities, dumping into the bigger rivers. So they had to clean them up, and to avoid the unfunded mandate, during the 80s, they came out with a lot of money. And Falmouth availed themselves of some of that money in the 1980s, and that's why we built the sewer system that we have today. Not every community did that, however. I have a difficult time having empathy with those communities because at the time, the federal government was saying, here's a set of regs you're going to have to meet. We need to clean up the nation's waterways. Here's the tools and the money to do it. I'm giving you the keys for the car. Change the oil and prepare for buying a new car down the road. So I guess my message for you today for all of this, don't be pointing a finger anywhere else because it's everybody in this room and everybody in this town and everybody in this state. This is not a problem that can be identified by the downtown area, or the east, or the west, or those that are on the water and those who are not on the water. Everybody in here flushes a toilet, guaranteed. Everybody's part of the problem. You're all going to leave here today and stick your key in the ignition of a car, and you are going to impact the atmosphere. You all live in a home. I presume nobody lives in a teepee. That is an environmental impact. Albeit small, it is an impact. So all of those solutions have to be able to span that entire spectrum. And I'll give you one last statement here called tragedy of the commons. And I like to use this periodically because it's an Aristotle philosophy that the phrase was coined by an author in 1964 named Garrett Hardin. And it just means that we take care of least that which we do not own. So the problem is there is no more personal responsibility. Even for all of the wastewater, everybody here did it, but nobody wants to own it. Nobody wants to accept it. When you go through a public park and you see the trash, you're the first to complain, but will you bend down and pick it up? No, so you're still part of the problem. You go to a public restroom, you wash your hands. You do one of these. If you do that at home, you get your head handed to you. But that's how we treat the public facilities. There is no personal responsibility or ownership if you don't own the facility. We own all of these problems. Whether you believe in climate change or not, it is happening. And the impacts are going to be there. And for those communities that are prepared for it, it'll be less. For those that are not, it's going to be very expensive. So for Falmouth, anyway, to say where we are today, on our wastewater facilities planning process. As Mr. Patrick had indicated, there is a comprehensive it's a water quality management committee, I think is what it is. And they're going to be looking at a number of different options. And hopefully that'll expand out to start looking at what's the town want to be for the future. We do have to be concerned about the impacts of those decisions. Does it mean growth? How are we going to manage growth? You heard about growth in a couple of these communities. One of them was in Australia where they said, oh, we did this, but what was the impact? 30,000 retail spaces and another 10,000 residential. That is growth. And understand that there are limits to that growth and limits on the resources. So my hope is that Falmouth, along with other communities, will properly plan these out, look in a much more holistic perspective. This is not just about wastewater. It is about water. It is about socioeconomics. It is about the demographic shifts that are going to occur, and it is about the environment overall. So there's a lot of valuable things out there that communities and government wants to do, but there's only so much money and so much ability to go. So, thank you.